Module 9b, Maturation. This is part 2 of that chapter that incorporates both growth and maturation. I would like to start this off by looking at this news clipping about a girl winning the state high school wrestling title, and she did it against a bunch of boys. Obviously, there are very few women wrestlers competing. It's a big deal to win a state championship. For our purposes as motor developmentalists, we are curious as to how she did it. Looking at her picture, is maturation a part of the elements that allowed her to be successful in her sport? I know it's a big elephant in the room, but if you're not willing to say it, I am. Look at her body structure. Is she mature yet? Is she fully mature? And is it to her advantage that she does not have breasts or well developed breasts? So, as an overview, we're going to talk about measures of maturation. We're going to talk about its effects on performance, especially contrasting early maturers versus late maturers. Okay. Before we do all of that, we need to know our indices of maturation. Let's start with dental development. Other than just acknowledging it here, no further discussion will be made. This is the domain of dentistry. For our purposes, the fact that the baby teeth, you shed them in order for the permanent teeth to come out, that's a level of maturation that's only very specific to dentition. Secondly, menarche. It's a first menstrual cycle for females. Obviously, the males don't have a counterpart event. Technically, menarche is part of the conversation with respect to sexual maturation, but secondary sexual characteristics itself will have its own set of indices, which is embodied in the Tanner Developmental Atlas. Last, skeletal age, bone. We will begin by discussing the last one. We'll do it in reverse. Skeletal maturity. How do we measure this? Obviously, the old school way, and it's still the most used way to do this right now, are x-rays. X-rays of the long bone allows us to have a view of the epiphyseal growth plates. Towards the ends of the long bones, there is that zone where the cells proliferate and at some point they fuse. That is an index of maturation. Recall that when we were talking about children being ushered into adulthood, and that one indicator that tells them they've stopped growing is the fusion of the epiphyseal growth plates. Also, with the x-ray, it is a way to assess appositional growth, in other words, the thickness of the bone, right at the middle of the shaft. Obviously, this has to be done with a long bone. Now, indirectly, height is an indicator of maturation. As the bones lengthen, you increase in height, and height itself implies maturation. However, it is with a lot of cautions involved. There could be some asymmetries that have to do with height and secondary sexual characteristics, for example. So again, appropriate cautions have to be made when using height as an indicator of maturation. Here are two caricatures or two drawings based on x-rays. The one on the left represents a younger individual, whereas the one on the right is several years older. What exercise science students should be concentrating on is what the indices there are that tell them that this is a younger kid. By counting the bones at the wrist, there are only 4 irregularly shaped bones here, whereas there are about 7 here. Look also at the head of the radius and the ulna. The absence or the space here indicates that this area is still mostly collagenous tissue, collagen. It hasn't calcified. In other words, the bone has not fully formed. In addition, looking at the spaces between the phalanges, you can tell that a lot more development is anticipated. Here we have not yet full, but the fact is this kid is at least 7 or 8 years ahead than this child. But here's a comparison of boys and girls. The same profile is for a 36-month-old girl and a 48-month-old boy. In other words, at 3 years old, the girls are already ahead of boys. 12 months in full. On the right, that gap in maturation just further increases. Um, this is a girl who is 10 and a half years of age and a boy that is 13 years old, solidly on the girls being way ahead of the boys. This did not materialize. Voila, it just happened. The fact that this is three, you can pretty much extrapolate that differences, or at least the advantage of girls as far as growing up, is has already started way before three. When we talk about the skeletal system, we are going to talk about the elements that make it useful for sport and that we want to maximize the performance of our kids. Therefore, if you want to avoid compromising the bone development, you have to consider the following: mechanical loading. In a general sense, we can either overuse or underuse the potential effect of gravity on the bones. We'll discuss first the underuse. In what conditions do we underuse gravity? We need to have weight bearing episodes in our lives. I mean, we do it on a daily basis, some more than the others. But when humans, such as your astronauts, travel in space, they are losing bone the minute they are in orbit. So potential for bone damage is there. You will not see NASA astronauts coming back to Earth being able to simply walk out of their capsules. They have lost so much bone at that point that they will need some rehabs and a regimen before they can be paraded in front of the public, obviously. Secondly, thing to consider here, right when the opportunities to optimize bone layering and mechanical loading working together, that's at the time when the growth spurt happens. At the time of development, when the kids need this most, unfortunately, data has shown that most girls begin to withdraw from sport or lessen their activity to the detriment of their health. Actually, we cannot recover that optimal window. It is that one point in life when mechanical loading serves a great purpose for bone layering. We could swing from one extreme to another. Recall that there is no justification for any parent to be training any child for a marathon at 4, 5, 6 years. You are talking about overuse of the same joints, getting the same impact repetitively, same type of motion. What you're inviting is injury. The other large item that has to do with the skeletal maturity is obviously nutrition and hormone. Hormone issues. For nutrition, front and center is calcium, and estrogen is part of the conversation because we'll look at the unique situation of female athletes experiencing what we call the female athlete triad. In sport where the strength to weight ratio favors a lot of the athletes that are on the light side, very thin, you're talking about figure skaters, ballet dancers, gymnasts, divers. It is not uncommon for these athletes to be experiencing anorexia and bulimia as they diet their weight to get to a certain, what they deem as ideal weight. But the body in its self-preservation mode, being subjected to, in some sense, a level of abuse, will self-preserve and halt certain functions that may not necessarily be important for survival. Thus, the second element of the female athlete triad is the onset of secondary amenorrhea. Amenorrhea is the condition where the menstrual cycle is halted. They have no periods. Why is it called secondary? It is because they previously had their menstrual cycle but is now stopped because the body is on self-preserve mode. Primary amenorrhea does not apply here. It has something to do with young girls not getting their menstrual cycle in much, much later fashion. Thirdly, and this is where the consequences become all too serious, these athletes who are subjecting themselves to this rather extreme dieting end up having osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is the condition where the bone is porous. This is not something that is to be trivialized. If you are going to be a coach, regardless of whether you're a male or female coaches, and no male coaches could be very, it could be a very awkward conversation, but the fact is, your job is to make sure that you have athletes who are healthy and who are optimizing their opportunities. Proceeding on with sexual maturation. The standard tool for this is the Tanner Atlas, the Tanner stages. They are caricatures of these are shown in the text. Basically, this is a self-evaluation process where the child is made to evaluate his own pubic hair, his or her own pubic hair. For females, the female breast development. For males, male genitalia or penile development. And the scale that's being used, 1 is a score for being in the least developed state, 5 being the most mature. Side note here, kids have been found to be very good self-evaluators as long as it's done privately and individually. The process involves going in a private room with a mirror. The kid scores himself, tells the clinician what level he is at, and the clinician confirms it by his own scoring. It's been very, actually, it's quite impressive that children are able to do this quite well. For the few errors that are made, the researchers also analyzed the pattern of errors. It is not very surprising that males, when they scored penile development, tend to overscore themselves. On the other hand, females, when they score their breast development, tend to underscore themselves. This harkens to the idea of socialization when we talked about in earlier modules. Girls and boys are, for the most part, socialized very differently. And if there are errors in perception, this is one of those places where you can see this. Menarche is really part of the conversation for sexual maturation, although it is not a secondary sexual characteristic. Your primary sexual characteristic is based on your chromosome. You're primarily male or female, XXXY. But your secondary sexual characteristics have to do with the physical expression of this: pubic hair, female breast, and male genitalia. But menarche, although it's not a secondary sexual characteristic, it has to do with sexual maturation. Menarche basically signals the age when where girls can now bear children. Average age in the United States for menarche is at 12.4 years. The issue is this number is increasingly lowering. It is not surprising to see some girls having their menstrual cycle begin at 11, 10, 9, and even 8. Last year in Lubbock, there was a kid who gave birth at the age of 9. It means maybe towards the latter part of 9, but the fact is she must have had her menarche either late 8 years old or early 9 years old. What does that imply? I mean, obviously, apart from the shock value, what is going on that kids are developing more rapidly now? What could explain that number? That the menarche age is starting to go down. What is a parallel event that's been going on in the US the past 30 years that could partly explain the lowering of the age? The obesity problem has been with us for that long. As the obesity indicators go up, apparently the menarche indicators also develop alongside it. If anything, this is an indicator that menarche is as much affected by the environment and the genetic components involved. I'll talk about the genetics of this in a short while, but let me finish the thought on menarche. If you think about it, menarche is a late event in the sequence of events in puberty. What starts out for girls is a mid-growth spurt. Recall your numbers. Mid-growth about 6.5 years old to 8.5. Growth spurt begins at about 10. MHV, or maximum height velocity. Other books will say peak height velocity. In other words, that period when the girls grow the fastest. Recall when we talked about skeletal maturation. This is the most productive time to lay bone mineralization. Maximum height velocity is typically reached about 12 on average. Menarche happens after peak height velocity or maximum height velocity. It is a late event in the sequence of puberty. So, in a sense, there is some sort of genetic component that tells you the order of the events are still there. However, because of environmental things, the whole cycle is being pushed earlier and earlier. Here are data of athletes and their mothers based on gymnasts, tennis, and swimmers. Clearly, there's a familial component in here. As late as the girls, these are elite athletes, by the way, as late as the girls are having their menarche, the mothers were also behind compared to the population at large. Average menarche being 12.4, these are still rather late numbers. In another set of data, again, the athletes proved to have menarche at a later age compared to the normal population. Does this mean that being a late mature, notice that I'm introducing the term late mature at this point, is that genetic or is it environment? It's going to be influenced by environment, as I said. In the realm of the normal population, when the population is increasingly getting more obese, there's a parallel event of menarche starting early. On the other hand, these are menarche of athletes. They are well-trained individuals. Is it because it's genetic or is it environment? Is it because they were training hard, that's why they're being delayed, or is there a genetic component to it? So there is a genetic component already, as we've determined, with the parents, basically with the mothers being a mirror, a sort of same pattern as them. Here we have a lot of late, not as much in the swimming, but if you look at the data on gymnastics, we think in terms of the sport performance itself. Is it an advantage? Well, it turns out it really depends on your gender and the sport you play. Early maturation is an advantage for boys, especially if your sport is football. Because early maturation means the hormones have started to kick in. Boys can now begin to have hair, lay on more muscle, respond or adapt to resistance training much better with the androgens kicking in. To girls, however, early maturation means that you are now able to have a baby if your menstrual cycle begins. It means now your breast development and uterus development, it's all about preparing the body to carry a child, which means a larger increase in adipose tissues. The filling out process is very different for boys and girls. Because of the need to lactate, in other words, to produce milk, it's a very different function for boys as opposed to girls, but it also requires a level of fat in there that boys do not typically lay on. Okay? So late maturation is an advantage for girls, for gymnasts. The later they have their menarche, they don't develop breasts. Let's go back to that wrestler. Had she been an early mature with a fully developed breast, wider hips, more adiposity at the hip and the thighs, she will be less mobile compared to what she could do at that age when she's not fully mature. Anecdotally, there was a semester where I had several of the students several of the members of the volleyball team were enrolled in my class, and all of them were had heights of at least 5'11" to about 6'4", I believe. And in the process of conversation, I asked them, when their menarche began. None of them started menarche younger than 15 years. So because they're late maturers, and obviously there's a genetic component already, they're all tall. They have parents who are probably taller, but it allowed them to, that window of time for them to grow without the added baggage of the fat and the adipose tissue for the breast and all of that. They maximize their time in learning skills in the sport. Whereas for the boys, early maturation means, they could, the actual structure has a time to mature earlier, add heft, and probably have an influence on sports such as football. Hey, in summary, when we assess growth, morphology, and maturation, in this case, in this module 9b, we only talked about maturation. We are interested in anthropometry and proportionality as far as growth is concerned, body types. Here, in this module itself, when you put things together and relate maturation to performance, you cannot divorce it from discussing secondary sexual characteristics and how they indicate whether the kid is an early or a late mature. Menarche is part of the conversation, and a huge part, if you want something that's quantitative, is the skeletal development. Okay, as a parting shot, by the way, this is very well photoshopped, or I don't know which software the author did this, but obviously, we want to allow our kids to mature at their own rates and in a way that's very healthy for them. Parents, this obviously parodies parents who live vicariously through their kids, hoping that with the information provided here, you will also be able to set your own standards and as far as preparing your kids for not only a productive life but a healthy life.